Good evening. You're on the smoking section, and my name is Stephen Helfer. Every Wednesday at 7 p.m. and talking about the politics, science, sociology, history of the war on tobacco, and standing up for people's autonomy. Particularly in regards to the smoking or chewing of tobacco. And today, Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights, after a while, a short hiatus, started tabling again today in Harvard Square. And the particular action that we're taking right now is sending postcards to President Obama regarding a proposal by the Department of Housing and Urban Development to ban smoking in the apartments of persons who live in public housing everywhere in the United States. Right now, a lot of cities have banned smoking in public housing, Cambridge and Boston among them. I don't think New York has. But right now, this is something that is being considered for a nationwide ban. And it's supposedly based on the fact, or the alleged fact, that smoke drifts from apartment to apartment, and people are bothered or even harmed by their neighbor's secondhand smoke. Although I don't think there has ever been a study purporting to show that living next door to a smoker, even a heavy smoker, even for a prolonged period of time, like 30 or 40 years, has had any health consequences. So this proposed ban by the Department of Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, really seems kind of like what you call a proxy war, meaning that it's supposedly to protect people from secondhand smoke, but in point of fact, it really is the war on tobacco and on people who enjoy tobacco. And when we fought that battle here in Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights, and were very successful in getting some very good concessions from the Cambridge Housing Authority, namely a very long process to evict or to sanction someone for smoking in his own apartment, and also allowing electronic cigarettes, which they had not intended to, and allowing smoking on the grounds. But the Alliance of Cambridge Tenants Act, who was fighting with us, not because they had any stake in the war on tobacco, but they felt this was just another area where the authorities would exercise power without any real need on people who have less power, to wit, their tenants. And tenants in public housing have very little control over their own lives and have to do everything they're told by the housing authorities. So, of course, some things are very important to do what you're told, but why add more to the list? But really, this whole thing was, again, and I'm taking this from the Wall Street Journal in an editorial they wrote, it's a proxy for the political war on smoking. And it's a way to penalize those people who continue to smoke, who do not do what they're told, and to make it very difficult for them to enjoy tobacco. But On our Facebook page, which has a lot of the information from which I'm now talking, there was a recent death associated with a man who was living in a elderly housing situation where he could not smoke anywhere in the building. Now, the only reason for this is not to protect people from secondhand smoke, but again to penalize those people who do not do what they're told. So he went outside to smoke, and evidently this was during Hurricane Matthew, and he was in a wheelchair, and it overturned, fell on top of him, and he drowned. So this is the kind of thing that we, Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights, is fighting. If you ban smoking in all public housing everywhere in the United States, how many elderly people, how many women, how many people with disabilities who are forced to go outside just because they want a cigarette end up being mugged or end up freezing to death because they may get locked out or anything like that. And you have to ask yourself, how far do you go to get people to do what you tell them to do? These people who are promoting these kinds of bans are in the field of public health, and they have ethics, that they're supposed to have ethics, and those ethics, as outlined both in the United States Constitution and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the UN, make specific provisions. In fact, our whole Constitution, the most fundamental right in the Constitution, as interpreted by the famous jurist Louis Brandeis, is the right to be left alone by the government. Now, that doesn't mean left alone under all circumstances and for all actions, but for personal matters such as having a cigarette in your own apartment. But back to the Alliance for Cambridge Tenants, repeatedly asked the Cambridge Housing Authority, well, if there were complaints about smoke drifting from other apartments, where is the data? And complaints are supposed to be registered. Any complaints that are taken by the Cambridge Housing Authority are supposed to be registered and documented. And the Cambridge Housing Authority was unable to come up with any. Now, I don't dispute that sometimes there may be an instance where, because of faulty ventilation or whatnot, people's can smell smoke coming from another apartment, but I think it's pretty far and few between. And also, if you live in an apartment building, you're going to be subjected to your neighbor's cooking fumes, perfume, incense. All of these things have particulate matter. To people who are highly sensitive, they could trigger an asthma attack or something like that. So really, again, this whole thing is a proxy war, or for a proxy for the political war on smoking. It has nothing to do with that. But we have been sending cards to President Obama, and I certainly don't have any, hope, for example, that he will read one of these cards, but someone will. Someone will read the cards, and someone who is somewhere in his administration. And if that happens, and we've already sent about 300 of these cards, we'll see what happens. But we do what we can to really champion what are not really just smokers' rights, but human rights. I mean, if you let some people be bullied and some people lose their rights, It's a loss really for everyone, and it is kind of poisonous to society in general. But again, there have been other instances where elderly people living in senior citizen homes and stuff where no provision, no accommodation, it's a kind of take no prisoners approach to public health, have died or have frozen to death because they couldn't get back in. And in this case, this person drowned, and this was reported, this story was reported, it was in South Carolina, and it was on our Facebook page just a few days ago. But the history of public health actually is, most people think of public health in a very benign way, and there is no doubt that public health has done a lot of good to alleviate suffering and sickness, prolong healthy life, but public health has its skeletons. Here in the United States, about 60,000 people were forcibly sterilized during the first half of the last century, and this was done as a form of eugenics, and it didn't even stop until the late 60s. And this was because federal public health officials felt that they had to make sure that these people wouldn't produce what were considered to be human beings that weren't worthy of being produced. The public health people in this country experimented by withdrawing syphilis medication to black syphilitics in Tuskegee, Alabama, and even when they received word or a letter from a very well-known doctor saying this is absolutely unethical, they continued to do it until into the 70s. And so there's many instances of where people in public health who, because of their desire for power and their thinking that they know what's best for everyone, often abuse this power. In the 90s, there were experiments on foster children using AIDS drugs, which was very much counter to what was considered ethical experimentation, because foster children don't have really an advocate for them like parents. And they were giving these children AIDS drugs to see how they worked. So this is another scandal, and I think the scandal of tobacco is that people are really being persecuted in the name of health. And certainly this is something that breaches any kind of ethical standard for doctors. And it has been, and there are many people in the field of public health who are studying public health, not the majority, but who agree with us. And but I did have one interesting encounter today, because a fellow came up to talk to me, and he said that he was not a smoker really, but he had a chronic disease that tobacco helped. And what he had is something called, or what he has is something called ulcerative colitis, which I'm not perfectly sure. It's some kind of disease of the intestines that can be pretty debilitating. And this is the first person I've encountered who has actually had this illness and is actually treated with tobacco, with cigarette smoking. And his doctor recommends cigarette smoking for him, not necessarily all the time, but during flare-ups. And this fellow who spoke to me, his name is, I think, Rick, or Nick. Nick told me that, if he smokes, like, during a flare-up, the results are very, very pronounced and very benign. It will clear up his ulcerative colitis very quickly. I mean, it's a chronic disease. Tobacco won't cure it, but it will end all the suffering that he goes through. And he doesn't really like smoking that much, so he tried the patch, but that didn't work at all. And of course, I recommended snus, which I think which has no secondhand smoke and does not is very, very nice thing, as I've mentioned many times on this program. And I asked him to promise me that he would get in touch with Brad Rodew, who is a professor of public health who is a big, big proponent of snus. And then, of course, Nick asked me, well, what about oral cancer? Because the public is getting this very, very exaggerated kind of scare tactics regarding snus, are chewing tobacco, and when it really, if you look at the statistics pretty carefully, there is almost no, the average non-smoker or non-tobacco user is subject to almost the same risk of oral cancer as someone who uses smokeless tobacco. So for some reason, any tobacco is bad tobacco in the eyes of course, you'd expect it, anti-tobacco activists. And of course, in addition to ulcerative colitis, there are many other things that Nick didn't know about. But again, from our Facebook page, I'm just going to read something from a woman named Dr. Anna Fells, who is a psychiatrist. And she wrote a very nice op-ed in the New York Times saying, "Can nicotine be good for you?" And she writes, "Nicotine has been shown to improve cognition, memory, attention, and mood, as well as reduce anxiety. People with serious mental illness, particularly schizophrenia and depression, smoke at much higher rates than people without them and have more trouble quitting, perhaps because nicotine ameliorates some of their symptoms." Well, I think anybody who has experienced anxiety or depression, fortunately, I hope no one that we're talking to right now has experienced schizophrenia, will be able to tell you that tobacco is a wonderful source for combating, or again, according to Dr. Fells, ameliorating those symptoms. Well, another thing that's happened is I've often followed the career of Chuck Berry, who is probably considered one of the founders, if not the founder, of rock and roll, and he just had his 90th birthday. And I know that in 1975, when he was interviewed by Rolling Stone, he claimed at least that he had quit smoking. But I saw him in a movie made by Keith Richards in the 80s, about 1985 or 83, and I saw him smoking in that movie, so I'm not so sure he was telling the truth. But certainly Chuck had a pretty long history of smoking, at least I would say 30 or 40 years. And so now he is at the age of 90, seemingly no worse for his 30 or 40 pack years of smoking. So much for the idea that tobacco is lethal. And Chuck also says that his grandfather lived to be 104 and smoked right up until the time of his death. But again, another example of the war on smoking is that traditionally tobacco companies have always helped by donating their products to soldiers. And of course, tobacco and war and tobacco and soldiers goes together very, very closely. And the FDA has recently forbidden cigar manufacturers from giving away free samples. And so it has become a political issue on whether the cigar makers can give free cigars to American soldiers in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan. And it appears that the FDA regulations, which were put in 2009, the FDA was given jurisdiction over tobacco, and recently they have ramped up their regulatory scheme to do a lot with cigars that they hadn't done before. And so now it seems like a lot of cigar manufacturers are afraid to give soldiers who are, risking their lives and, seeking just some kind of relaxation. And it is a very most requested item, but we can't give them cigars because it may be bad for their health. They may, get their leg blown off, or worse, but a cigar will really, do something terrible for them. But fortunately, in a bit of bipartisanship, a representative, Kathy Castor, a Democrat from Florida, and a California Republican, Duncan Hunter, who did combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, are both doing what they can to either change the FDA regulations or clarify if, in fact, these regulations that forbid cigar companies from giving out free samples would prevent them from donating to soldiers serving overseas. So that's a nice piece of bipartisanship in this politically turmoiled season that we're living in. But soldiers have always smoked to ease anxiety, to ease boredom, steel themselves, all these kinds of things. So many soldiers in the Second World War smoked, and sometimes they say that smoking, the anti-smokers, which they blame every particular kind of medicine, every particular disease or ill condition that they can on smoking, says that it causes impotence. But what's interesting is that after 80% of American soldiers smoked in the Second World War, but when they came home, we had the baby boom, and so it didn't seem like their impotence got in the way, or that the smoking got in the way of them siring probably the largest explosion of births in the history of the country. But everything is turned by anti-smokers. Everything is turned around. Like, for example, Lucky Strike during the war changed the coloring of its pack from green to white because the pigment was needed for the war effort. So this, by anti-smokers, this is seen as some kind of evil public relations tactic and nothing good. But as a matter of fact, tobacco manufacturers have a long history of some very philanthropic and good actions. They were the first, for example, in the South, where the tobacco is grown in the 5 southern states, they were the first industry to elevate blacks to positions of management, and of course the whole culture of tobacco and the growing of tobacco is so intertwined with the United States and with its colonies. There would have been they would not have survived without tobacco. There's no question of that. In fact, I was recently visiting Baltimore and was looking at a book. I got to get this book again because I need to get this quote. It's an interesting historical quote. But the whole city of Baltimore owes its existence to tobacco, because it was really plotted, the land was plotted, everything was, there wasn't any city there, but they wanted to make a place to store tobacco in the colony of Maryland. And that's how the whole city of Baltimore grew. And it's interesting because this book where I found this out was written, I think, around 1960 or 1970, maybe as late as 1980. I don't know. But if that book had been written now, that would, my guess is that would be excised, because you wouldn't want to put tobacco in any kind of light. Like, the history would be changed so as to make it more amenable to the war on tobacco that we are now experiencing. Well, thank you for watching the smoking section. Go to our Facebook page, Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights. And if you want to talk to us, we're in Harvard Square at least several days a week, right near the pit. Again, thanks for watching the smoking section. Good night.